afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Fifth Step webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about complex change and in particular about cloud migration. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Mike Starnes and by Karl Heydenrych, who is actually calling in remotely. So Karl will introduce you in just a moment, so just get ready to unmute. Today we're going to be, let me move the monitor on, there we go. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Mike.
Hi.
Mike is here from Foundation IT. So Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I head up client services within Foundation IT. I guess principally we're a infrastructure services business. We've been doing that for the best part of 20 years plus, so we've seen various waves of change in that time. I've been involved in IT for the best part of 15 years, wearing many different hats. It's a delight to be here and contribute to this webcast.
Well, thanks very much. And Karl, perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Karl Heydenrych. I was the IT director at St. John Ambulance for many years, about 9 or 10, and took them to the cloud. And now I'm doing interim CIO work, and I'm currently at WWF UK.
That's great, Karl. Thank you very much. Right, well, let's make a start. Let's cover off some housekeeping. We're recording this webinar, so any questions you ask, and we do really encourage you to ask questions, you can ask them in the panel on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar meeting application there. We're recording it, so any questions you ask will be rebroadcast, so do please consider that if they're read out. The audio will be available on our podcast channel, so you can subscribe to that. The details are all there. And you'll be able to find the video at fifthstep.com/videos. And these handouts will also be available as part of both the channels, whether it be audio or video as well. As I say at the bottom, please do ask questions throughout. We've got time at the end to answer any questions. Ask them as they occur to you. I will give you prompts, as you can imagine. And for those of you who have attended before, you'll know the format. But do please ask them as you go along and as you think about them. And there are no silly questions. Cloud is something that can be complex to many organizations, can be challenging in various different ways. And what's challenging to you guys or to one of you may not necessarily be challenging to another, but it's those kinds of things that we really want to try and help you with and demyth some of this. So Mike, why don't you tell us about or describe the different types of cloud and some of the definitions?
Yeah, the all-encompassing term used to describe anything nowadays. And I think you make a good point that cloud is different things to different people. I think taking it up to the very top level, I mean, my definition of cloud and cloud computing is leveraging the internet to consume applications or data, and there are some subcategories underneath that sort of define cloud types or deployment models. So I think most people will be familiar with the concept of adding as a service after some component, and starting off with probably one of the easier concepts of software as a service. We're leveraging GoToWebinar or GoToMeeting now, which is an example of software as a service. Effectively, you're consuming an application via the web. We don't have a care in the world really for what hardware it's running on, where that hardware is running.
No, generally we don't. We know that it's running on a server, right? But it is, to all intents and purposes, as long as we can connect and everyone can hear us, we're not really worried, are we?
Yeah, and we're not updating that hardware either. The other end of the scale, I guess, consuming infrastructure as a service, whereby you've got core infrastructure, components, server, storage, networking, and you're consuming that typically on a pay-as-you-go basis over a internet connection. Mm-hmm. And platform as a service, which is probably the harder of the three to define, whereby you're taking IaaS, very popular obviously with developers, you're layering on top of that some of the tools that they need to deploy applications. Mm-hmm. So could be middleware, could be databases, could be an operating system that they can spend more time coding and far less time worrying about whether the infrastructure is patched or not.
Yeah. So if we were to summarize that or to give some examples of that for people who are not familiar with these terms, software as a service, we gave the example of go to webinar that we're using at the moment.
Salesforce.com,
yeah,
Office 365.
Great.
To some extent.
Examples of infrastructure as a service. Are there many? Obviously, to me that means things like Amazon Web Services, AWS, and things like that. But for the non-technical people, there's not going to be examples of that because that tends to be hidden behind the scenes.
It does. There are lots of businesses offering infrastructure as a service, and there are different flavors of that. You get public cloud services, and I think this is a segue into kind of the next slide, I guess. But Microsoft obviously have their Azure offering, Amazon with Amazon Web Services, you've got Google Cloud. They're examples of infrastructure as a service. You've got other organizations that are providing niche infrastructure which can be consumed by certain industries, or perhaps they don't want to utilize public cloud services, and it's more of a private infrastructure as a service. They're paying as they go for potentially dedicated hardware as opposed to publicly multi-tenanted hardware.
All right. Well, you've set everyone up for the excitement of the next slide. So let's see what we've got here.
It's almost like that was rehearsed.
Almost.
It wasn't. It wasn't.
Like it was. Though, yeah.
So I guess deployment types, and there are a few of these. As you say, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure are providing a very open platform for people to rock up with a credit card, go to a web portal and allocate themselves a server, some storage, and more or less have free rein to do as they please with those resources. Hybrid cloud uses typically a combination of on-premise hardware, sometimes private cloud infrastructure, and indeed public cloud to kind of give a mix of different platforms, often labeled as hybrid cloud. It's probably the most prominent cloud model that we see today within our kind of community of clients, simply because most of them haven't moved everything to one cloud platform. We typically find there are several. Outside of that, you've got private cloud, which tends to be dedicated to an organization. That could be hosted by the organization themselves, or it could indeed be a third party providing that. But ultimately, it's dedicated to that one organization. Community cloud is the other one we've got up on screen there, which is not something that I personally had a huge amount of exposure to, but clearly it's becoming a more prominent area because effectively the definition of that is you've got organizations with mutual interests. It could be that they're utilizing the same application. It could be they need access to the same data, and they're leveraging a single cloud platform to gain access or collaborate on that platform. Very prominent within higher education,
yes, of course,
local government, but you've also got life sciences and financial services organizations leveraging the same type of cloud model. So, there's lots of sub-definitions there under cloud, and I think it articulates the point that it can mean different things to different people, and it's also complex.
It's very, it is. But I think what we've, our aim there was to demystify some of those terms for people who are not familiar with them, and to try and give some examples. And hopefully we've done that. Hopefully we've demystified some of it at the very least, and put some examples to the names. Okay, so we sort of prefixed or subtitled this webinar as complex change, and that cloud is complex change. So I thought we'd put in a definition about what complex change is. It can mean very different things to different organizations, but this is a fairly generic and general definition, and it's one that may be useful for certain people in certain organizations to just use as a guide. Are we dealing with something that should be considered as complex change and therefore it's higher risk, or is it something that's not defined as complex risk, but it's still complex to our organization for whatever reason? So usually we say that a complex change involves at least two of the following things: business processes or changes to business processes and or the ways of working, changes to an individual's roles. So we're talking about the actual work that an individual does. That may be through a business process. It may even be that some people are moved on to completely different roles, that their role no longer exists as it has done because a system is going to replace that. Organizational change, so that can mean moving people around. It can be meaning changes of target operating model or financial structure of the organization, things like that. And it can involve critical system implementation or indeed the replacement of a critical system as well. So within cloud, you've got many of those. Depending on the system that you're implementing, you've certainly got organizational change. There are certainly aspects there where the organization and the culture of the organization has to get behind this movement. And you're obviously changing a critical system and implementing or replacing a critical system, or very often you are. And that may also mean that you've got individual roles that are changing as well. So the way that a person performs a role, or indeed whether they perform that role at all, may change or may not exist. Karl, have you got anything to add to that conversation specifically, or that definition? Is there anything else that you might add in there?
In terms of complex change, I mean, it is just another change program moving to cloud, but it's a technology that people are, less and less now, but was quite new and so it made it look scarier. But I think what you've defined there in terms of what complex change is, it directly falls into this, because moving to the cloud for us certainly changed people's roles, changed some business processes, because we did SaaS as well. The organizational change piece came in this, so we actually had almost all of those, because we also changed our critical systems, some of them, and at least the platform they were running on. So no, you've covered it off there.
Great stuff. Mike, anything else that you'd add to complex change, or a definition, or have you seen any examples of complex change for cloud that have perhaps fallen outside of those categories?
I don't think so. I think the prominent point from the definition is how many of those will impact people, and how
Absolutely right.
how much of both an enabler and a blocker they can be to complex change. But all of those resolve around, to some extent, people, and I think that's absolutely right.
Great stuff. Okay. Now, this is a question that I think we've probably all been asked at one point in time or another, to varying degrees of hilarity to begin with, in the old days of cloud, but even today, more seriously, we have people asking, well, why would I go to the cloud? I've got my nice shiny server with the bright flashing lights on the front, so why would I go to cloud? Now, Karl, in your experience with St. John's Ambulance, talk us through some of the decision-making process there around why you ultimately decided to go for cloud, because when you were very first looking at this, you were thinking of it as more of a traditional refresh.
Absolutely, yeah. We were, going down the route of looking at all the servers we need to replace, the disaster recovery center that we need to duplicate everything in. We were doing a desktop refresh at the same time, as well as the delivery of our applications, which at the time, most of the core applications were being delivered using Citrix. So we had our own sort of old-fashioned local private cloud to a degree, but it was, it required a lot of watering. The maintenance was huge. It distracted the team a lot. So while I was going through that process, there were a lot of conferences I was going to where the cloud was obviously being mentioned by the marketeers, especially, and the salespeople, and talking to more and more IT directors that were sort of going, well, this thing might be good, we might be able to use this, and then actually speaking to some trusted partners and seeing how it really works, getting a better feel for it. I thought, this is something I really do need to explore more seriously. It's not just marketing hype. And I mean, I'm talking about, I think it was 2010, 2011 when I really started this journey.
Yeah.
and looking into it. So back then there was a lot of smoke and mirror type stuff, as you can imagine. So it required a lot of looking into, but I kind of had a belief that this was where it was going, and stuck with it. But you're right, we very much were going to go down the traditional refresh route, but I'm sure we'll get into a lot more, of the reasons later on, but it was really about freeing up my team, freeing myself up from running all that sort of commodity IT that required a lot of time and reactive time. So yeah.
Yep. Now, the other panel on this this presentation page that we've got here at the moment is the cloud is well established. Now, again, to those of us who are close to the cloud and to some of the software as a service applications and you know, some of the applications that are really quite mature out there, this may seem like a very obvious statement, but it's not obvious to everyone. And I still speak to CIOs and to business leaders who are very nervous about the cloud, about the security of the cloud in some respects. But you know, I think we all need to, you know, everyone who from the CIO downwards needs to be helping their organization understand the security of the cloud and that it is well established and that it is something that warrants our investigation at the very least. As we talk about later on, it's not always, you know, the best solution, but it's one that should always be considered. Mike, have you come across any scenarios where organizations are nervous of the cloud or don't feel it's well enough established for their environment?
Absolutely. I think cloud can be a very divisive subject within key stakeholders. You've got some that are absolutely pro-cloud and others that are anti-cloud for various reasons, security being absolutely one of those reasons, cost being another in terms of the interpretation of cost. I think some people see it as a risk in terms of single points of failure and that type of thing. And I think it's about understanding what cloud is to that individual organization, how it can help them. But we're still seeing organizations performing traditional refreshes, sometimes because they're nervous about cloud and they don't understand it well enough to take that leap of faith, and it's just the wrong timing for them.
Yes.
I think we also see it as, well, they're genuinely not ready to make that leap. Thus, they're going through what they consider to be their final refresh as the platform to move to cloud, or aspects to cloud. But it's a very divisive subject. I mean, being really, really bold about this, and this is just an opinion, Darren, so don't shoot me down for it. But of course, I can definitely see parallels with what cloud computing is doing with aspects of what we went through during the Industrial Revolution, whereby we've got you know, factories generating their own power to perform whatever business tasks that they were performing, making widgets or what have you. You know, ultimately, applications and what they sit on is sort of today's power alongside people to drive businesses forward. And I genuinely see, and this may not be for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, a point where we're consuming all of this stuff as a utility or as a service, and people won't worry about what piece of tin it's running on in the background. But we're not there yet. And there's certainly lots of pushback from people and business for lots of reasons around why cloud.
Now that's a point that we've come back to a couple of times, and I'll just highlight it, but we will talk about it some more, undoubtedly. But what we're really saying here is that the transition to cloud isn't a pure IT project. The implementation is an IT project, of course, but the persuasion and the creation of the business case is actually far more people orientated and persuasion orientated. And I think that's why some organizations have found it more difficult than others, and why some organizations are still very much cautious about the cloud and concerned that the security may not be right, or it's not right for them.
And there's nothing magic about it, right? I mean, this stuff is still sat on a server somewhere.
Well, that's right.
and consuming storage. It's the same. It's just a different delivery model.
That's right, and that's sometimes amazing to non-technical people as well, because they hear the term the cloud, they don't really know what that means. No, but yeah, we all understand, of course, that it's sitting on a server somewhere and sitting on storage. Good. So these were some of the arguments and some of the discussions, or some of the benefits of why cloud. And Karl, why don't you run through a couple, and then Mike, perhaps you can explain a couple, and I'll do some as well, and then we'll see how far we get. So Karl, why don't you pick off your favourite?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this definitely came into my list when we were going to move into the cloud, and I think one of the big ones for us was improved backup and disaster recovery. backups for the number of servers and complex applications that we have. It was just proving to take up a huge amount of time in my team, and we couldn't, hand on heart, always say that everything was always backed up 100% the way that it should have been. And that was, definitely keeping us awake at night and consuming a huge amount of energy, and disaster recovery almost equally in the same boat. It often depends on the size of your estate and the complexity and so on and so forth. So it might not be for everybody, but that was definitely a big driver for us, that it was just consuming time for this insurance policy, basically, So I was just like, well, wow, if we can, give that to somebody else and they can prove to us over and over again that it's always working, that's fantastic. We can worry about running the applications rather than actually, if the application goes down or the server's gone, can we get it back? So that was a big one for us. And then for me personally, that free IT to increase business value was another of my top two, if I have to choose two here, because traditionally IT, as much as we would want to get involved in all the cool digital stuff that the rest of the business was wanting to do or doing as shadow IT, we couldn't, because we had to keep all the tin running. We had to make sure all the cables were plugged in. We had to make sure the storage wasn't falling over. We had to make sure the emails were flowing. Instead, we could have been doing things like coming up with new apps within the business, helping them get the most out of the applications that they already had, helping them integrate their data, helping them get value out of the systems they've got, or working in a partnership to find new ways of working. So freeing my team up and myself up to be able to do that was hugely important to me, rather than being the guys that were keeping the lights on the tin, because that's not bringing any business value. It's like Mike said, plugging something into an electrical socket to get power isn't where the value is. The value is in the thing that you're powering, and that's the transition that I wanted to make.
Fantastic, Karl. That's really good points. Mike, why don't you cover off two or three if you like, but
sure.
do a couple.
Well, as Karl's stolen my favourite too, I think the promise of cloud, and the way that I think Karl's already mentioned, it's been sold in marketing. I think that people have done a very good job of that, but the reality is that when you look at the prospect of unlimited compute and storage, or at least the ability to have a pool of elastic compute and storage, which you pay for what you consume, at least that the theory behind it, pay for what you use, switch it off when you don't need it, etc., is very appealing. And I think the point about it being constantly upgraded, I think is also an interesting one, because I think that those organizations going through traditional refreshes now are still having to predict more or less 5 years into the future what their business might look like. I mean, how do they know what acquisitions might be around the corner, what they might have to absorb in that time, how their client base might grow in that time, and what they might need? It's almost an impossible question to answer. So you're paying for stuff that you potentially don't need in that time. And in 3 years' time, when the next hot technology comes out, you're outdated. So how do you deal with that? And that's kind of some of the stuff that we see in terms of being able to pay for what you need, not be worried about sort of scaling up and scaling down, because you've got the resources there to do so, and knowing you're sort of always on the latest and greatest platform. In theory, it is, I think, a massive headache away from both procurement and IT teams generally.
I'd agree, and I think you've started to air there into the area of one of my favourite ones on this list, which is an enabler for business-focused IT. I think that's very much a big thing that organisations don't understand is necessarily going to be a benefit initially, because it not only does it free people up, as Karl's already said, but it enables the business to be the IT side of the business to be more focused on the production capabilities of the business, and to be more business focused and more business aware. I also like the fact that the performance levels are, we've put it in here, in quotes, always achievable. Now they are always achievable, but that's obviously at a price. They can be achievable as well with on-premise tin, of course they can, but that also comes at a price. But it does mean that they're far more likely to be achievable at a potentially more reasonable price. But as we talk about soon, it's not always about being cheaper, but the options are there for you to be able to deal with that. Consumer grade IT. Now I blame Apple completely for this, even though I've got my iPhone and my iPad sitting here. I blame Apple for this because prior to Apple, if you remember back into those dim and distant past, before the iPhone, executives were more than happy, in fact, very pleased to have a BlackBerry, and they'd have the BlackBerry that the CIO, mandated or had authorized. And they were very happy with that. And then along came Apple, and they said, well, this isn't really for the enterprise, this is for you as an individual. And they suddenly made consumer IT really cool and powerful, and far more powerful than enterprise IT. It suddenly leapfrogged over. So consumer grade IT and consumer grade services and cloud services, I think, are really important.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll just jump in on that. That was going to be my third one if I could have a third, because sorry, Mike, I'm stealing your thunder, but our users, I
was going to relay to you anyway, Karl. It's fine.
Our users were getting really fed up with enterprise IT, which used to be the latest and greatest compared to what you could afford at home. But like you say, Apple and others came along and changed that and turned it on its head, especially with apps and the app ecosystem. And if enterprises couldn't keep up, people would come into the business and be like, what are you using? I have to log on where, and I'm tied to this desk, and I have to use this old app that, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas things like Mike's mentioned, Salesforce is a pretty good example of one of the really early ones. They were one of the first proper enterprise apps that had an app on the App Store that you could work at your desk on a desktop, but you could also have this cool consumer type app on your phone as a salesperson or whatever out on the road. And that's really powerful, I think, for your user base.
You're right, Karl. Yeah, I think we're all in violent agreement on that. The last one on the list that we've sort of covered in the previous slide was the improved security. Many people will cite an improved security. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day who was on site with Microsoft in their Azure data center, and they were talking about the levels of security that were available within that data center, and talking about how it was unachievable for a normal enterprise to aim to achieve that level of sophistication, but sophistication of the type where they're actually monitoring the movement of people around the racks and in the corridors that run between the racks, and all that kind of stuff. So they're actually monitoring movement and saying if someone stops for too long, and what is too long they define, but if they stop for too long, then that's actually flagged as a warning. Is someone doing something they shouldn't be doing? Are they still supposed to be there? That kind of level of sophistication isn't something that most enterprises have in their server closet, where they're still running.
Yeah. So there aren't many businesses that can put a data center under the sea either, is there? Yeah.
No, absolutely, yeah. So you've got those kinds of examples. Okay, let's talk about some of the myths, and without infringing any copyright of any American TV programs, let's do some myth busting around cloud myths. So, Karl, why don't you cover off the first three of these, and then Mike, you cover the next three, if that's okay. So,
Sure.
Karl, over to you.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of the early days, all the salespeople were telling us how cloud would be cheaper. You'll save so much money. You can spin it up and off and down and up and whatever you want, and it'll always be cheaper. More recently, especially the people that are maybe more reticent about moving to the cloud say it's definitely more expensive. No matter what you do, the calculations will always come out higher. My experience at St. John of moving to the cloud was actually, and I sort of put in my business case, so I'm very glad it turned out this way, was that it worked out roughly the same over the period that we depreciated our hardware, which was 3 years. I also did a 5-year plan, and it worked out, again, pretty much the same. You can't be exact, but when you take in the power to run the data center, the cost of the hardware refreshes, the support contracts you have for all of that stuff, the management of it. And then the things that we didn't actually quantify into a number was the management time. So not just the management of the servers, but the management of the people that would run the servers and the systems that you would have on-prem, as well as the management time lost. So for instance, in my role, CIO, IT director, in terms of dealing with if there's a P1 or major incident that has to get escalated up, or there's just so many other things that we didn't quantify but we knew would add to it, which in the end really made it kind of a cost neutral exercise for us. And my line in the business case, which I think I've shared with you, Mike, that I think you liked, was we weren't doing it to what was it? I'm trying to remember now. I just said I've told you. We weren't doing it to save money. We were doing it for the same money to get better IT. So what you said about security, Darren, is so true. We couldn't achieve the security levels that we did in the cloud locally. So we were spending roughly the same amount on security, but the cloud made it so much more affordable that our security was better. So that's just one example, but basically we were getting better IT for the same money, and our users agreed. When I left St. John, a lot of people said to me, the IT here is so good, it just works. We come in the morning and we work, which is a huge thing. People assume IT should just work, but it's never that easy. So that was brilliant. And zero management. That's a definite no. So while it reduced our management time for the on-prem stuff, it still requires management. You've still got to look after your spend. You've got to make sure it doesn't get out of control. The kind of things that happened when virtualization first came around with server bloat, and everybody just, we'll just have another virtual machine for this and for that. And, similar things in the cloud, as well as managing the tenancy around the security settings, loads of things like that. So it's not a zero management platform. It doesn't take everything away. What it does is make sure that all the things that are commoditized and don't make a difference to your business, like the tin, that's gone. So that's
Great.
pretty much it for me.
Thanks, Karl. Mike, you cover off the next three for us.
Yeah, sure. And if I may, across all of these, I think that it kind of further goes to show how divisive cloud can be, because I've seen all of these statements in articles, and I've certainly heard them as well. From a security perspective, you've touched upon some of this already, Darren, about a cloud provider's investment in physical security around the data centers, et cetera, their hosting. Ultimately, cloud can be as secure as you want it to be. You've got the benefit of having an organization's investment in the physical security and all the other bits they do around, whether it be fingerprint scanning and retina scanning and all that type of stuff, to actually get into the physical building. But then the protection of data typically still in a lot of instances remains the responsibility of client. And you can make that as secure otherwise as you wish it to be. There's no one size fits all from a security perspective in terms of the layers of security that you can then apply. So I think there are lots of people that think that moving to cloud is going to be more secure. There are others that think it's going to be less secure. It's a risk. The reality is it's another platform that you need to think about. Okay, how are we going to secure the data? Who has access to it? That is ultimately something that needs thinking about, and scenarios can be different.
And that doesn't really change, does it? Whether you're in cloud or you're in on-premise, you still have to think about things that way. So what we're actually saying is the statement of whether it's more secure or less secure is actually an organizational thing more than it's cloud, because it may be more secure, maybe less secure if you don't treat it and don't deal with it in the right ways.
Absolutely.
And this one here, the cloud's always the right 100% right. 100% cloud is always the right strategy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You should go all in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, not necessarily. I think every scenario is slightly different. I mean, I think actually, Karl, what you did with SGA, which is more or less 100% cloud, in my experience, is fairly unique. That's not to say there aren't other organisations that have done it successfully, but I think there are certain instances where cloud doesn't always make sense. Organisations with very steady state infrastructure, that are going to be running the same things for a period of time, they may decide that actually, well, that doesn't make sense to move to cloud. It doesn't make commercial sense, it doesn't make business sense. Of course, they may be running legacy applications which can't make the jump to cloud, which means they need to keep some stuff in-house.
That's a very good point.
So I think every scenario we kind of come across tends to be slightly different. In some instances, they're going cloud first, 100% into the cloud, that's where we want to kind of go. It's kind of taking that back a step and saying, okay, where are you today, where are you trying to get to, and what are the steps to get there, and that will sort of define the strategy.
Yeah. Okay, and the last one on the list here is our data is in the cloud, so we're safe. Well, that sort of implies that you don't need to have any disaster recovery or business continuity considerations just because you're in the cloud. Now, I would always recommend organizations to make sure they are taking responsibility for their own future and their own data in that respect. You never know what's going to happen. I mean, and we've seen some quite major organizations change direction and to either enable new functionality, which perhaps makes a product inappropriate, or indeed to disable functionality, which means that it's no longer appropriate for organizations. So make sure that you've got your capability, you can take your data with you, and that you are also backing up your data and keeping it safe, and that you're not just relying on the constant availability of the same cloud application. It's fine to back up to the cloud, of course, but just change devices or change cloud platforms if you're going to do that.
Really good point. And I think you have to go into these things with your eyes open a little bit, because you take a platform like Azure. Yes, it's replicated across 3 different places, but that place could be the same rack unless you click the right button to say, put it across multiple racks. So if they take that rack down, you may be losing out data. If there's a change that an individual makes to a piece of data that you're kind of consuming and can't reverse that change, then you're in a bit of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Okay, cloud blockers, and we're going to talk about this one a little bit quickly, just run through this one. But there are a number of people or groups within any organization that's going through a transition to the cloud who will have concerns. Now, the IT team may sound like a strange one, but very often they can be one of the parts or one of the blockers within an organization, because the teams have extensive experience and expertise within the current environment. Some of them will have expertise in cloud as well, of course, but they can, if you're not careful, or if you're not explaining it to them and explaining how their roles evolve and their jobs evolve, and that it does actually free them up to do the bigger and better things that actually add more value to the business, they can actually get caught in the loop of, well, my job's going away, I have expertise in on-premise stuff, this is all going cloud, this is all new to me, I don't understand it. So make sure that you're dealing with those kinds of concerns and recognizing those concerns, particularly within your IT team. And we've already spoken about those who are nervous about security and privacy. Make sure that you're understanding and recognizing all the different vectors there. And as the tips suggest on the right-hand side, recognize and plan for those concerns, address the concerns, address them head on, train and educate, and repeat, because it won't be heard necessarily the first time. You may have to say it a number of times, and you may have to hold a number of different sessions to help people get used to this change in the way that they're going to be working, or indeed the way that the organization is evolving. So a cloud solution assessment all sounds very, very useful, a very high-tech solution to what we're going to do. So, Karl, why don't you talk about some aspects of this, and then Mike and I'll switch in and out on some of this stuff as well. But if there's some certain aspects there that you wanted to draw upon in terms of how, for St John's Ambulance, you went through this kind of process.
Sure, yeah. So that that first block really is, about what does the business need from IT at the bare minimum, at that level that you're looking at this. So we were looking at, mainly infrastructure as a service and things like that. So I was talking to, trusted partners, as you mentioned there, about, well, this is how we need to run our PCI platforms for payment cards, or, these are the health records that we need to process, and, regulatory requirements, banks, for instance, there are going to be business requirements that aren't IT. They aren't about how flexible, how much can we scale, how fast can we do this. They're actually about the data or the process. So that's really important to get up front, because some of those could be absolute showstoppers. So that's absolutely vital at the start. The assessment criteria there, you're starting to head more into the, what can IT give to the business? So the flexibility piece for us was about being able to burst when needed for campaigns and things like that, but also for changing, we started to reduce the number of servers that we actually needed because we were moving more and more to SaaS. So we also wanted to have the flexibility to go down, which is really important from a steady state. So not just burst and back, but actually steady state and down. So that those criteria have to be really well defined, and you just think about, what am I doing now? What do I want to do in the future? What are the things that I'm really struggling with at the moment? And that you start to build up your requirements log basically from those business requirements, those IT requirements, those things that are your pain points. And it's almost like, if I had a magic wand, what would I want my infrastructure to be able to do? And start from there, or it's not always going to be realistic, but that's important to really nail down those requirements up front. I know it's something that's said at every outset of every procurement process or program, but it's absolutely vital to make sure you get the right cloud platform, because while it's relatively easy to move around compared to old-fashioned on-prem IT, it's still a painful process if you get it wrong, especially.
Yeah, that's very true, Karl, actually.
Yeah. The cloud models that Mike mentioned earlier around, it could go private. So it is sort of basically an on-prem version. It's not wrong. It could be that you can't take it out of your control to that extent. And also don't necessarily think about just doing an IaaS move. So for instance, we did that because we had some real drivers around hardware refresh requirements and failing hardware. We did a sort of lift and shift for the majority of our infrastructure, but you could also go straight to SaaS for something. You might have an on-prem CRM system at the moment, and your move to cloud could be going to Salesforce. So there's lots of different ways to get into the cloud. There are lots of different models that might suit you better. It depends on what your drivers are, your timescales, your depreciation or lease periods. So a lot of those things need to be taken into consideration. I definitely would say using trusted partners is important, because you'll probably only move to the cloud once. You might move around in the cloud, but you're only going to do it once, or in a phased approach, certainly. So to build up all the skills and experience and have that knowledge and history behind you as a single organization is extremely difficult, if not often impossible. So you do need to draw on other people's experience to really get the most out of it, and to make sure that you aren't putting yourself and your organization at too much risk.
All good points and well explained, actually, Karl. I think that's really really good.
Great, thanks.
Now, we've spoken about making the business case for cloud, and Karl, you spoke about this earlier on, and one of the challenges is often exactly what you described it as. That what we're actually going to do is provide better IT for roughly the same money, and that's phenomenal. That can be a benefit in itself. Of course it can, because you're getting something better, and it's going to be roughly the same money with all the challenges there. But in trying to define that and build out a business case, there are a number of things to remember and include, and these are things that are very often overlooked when organizations are looking at what the total cost of ownership is for particular systems. So bear these in mind as you're going through your the creation of your business case, or the definition of your business case for any move to cloud. So include the total cost of ownership of the existing solution. So make sure you're including, the engineers who are doing the patching and, the replacement of the servers. That's probably fairly obvious, any software licensing. But it tends to be the hidden time of how much time people actually end up having to spend working on this system in the background that gets forgotten or gets glossed over because, well, they're an assumed cost. We've got those guys already. So make sure that you're considering it. Go ahead, Karl.
Sorry, Darren, I didn't mean to jump in there. Just one of the key ones that actually a lot of people forget about is electricity. It's such a simple thing, you overlook it, but the power to run your servers is then almost doubled again to cool them. So, the more servers you get rid of, the less cooling you need. That calculation needs to go in, and for us, it was tens of thousands a year, at least.
Yeah, good. Good extra point there. There's also one of the things that's overlooked is the cost of running an older technology or solution. Now, I know organisations in financial services are paying tens of thousands, and some instances much more than that, of pounds just to maintain an old version, an out-of-date version of a system, because they need to pay additional maintenance to keep that up and running, but they feel that it's cheaper than them migrating to the next version or migrating to a cloud version or something like that. So some organizations are willing to pay for that. That's fine, but make sure that you're considering the costs and the potential opportunity costs, because there is very often cost of doing nothing. So think about that in your considerations. It may help you build your business case if you can actually demonstrate some of those things. And in the last point, in terms of our things to remember, think about the alignment with the strategy. The cloud is most definitely an enabler, and the benefits and agility and scalability. So if your organization has a strategy to double in size in the next 2 years, let's make it relatively aggressive. What does that mean? How are you actually going to be able to do that? Well, cloud is an enabler for that. And if you are able to justify the transition to cloud on the basis of being strategically aligned with business requirements, then that's a really good additional aspect to your business case.
Absolutely.
Now, we've included this. This is a very high level. This is very much just a picture of what some aspects of a cloud program may include, and others will include other things. But the real idea here is that this is, you've got a complex program of work here, and some of these things will run in parallel. Some of them will be streams of their own making, etc., etc. But the idea is here, you're going to have people running this. You're going to have project and program managers who are going to be involved in actually making sure this is running to time, and that things are getting done in the right order at the right time, and things aren't getting lost or missed or dropped. And I've included the nice big arrow there with the repeat cycle around the implementation, because very often you will be going backwards and forwards around those cycles, and particularly the communication aspect. As I suggested earlier on in the hints and tips, you need to be communicating frequently and often, not only what your status is and that you're on track and that you're moving over and how that's going to affect people, but actually making sure that people know that the project is still ongoing. Don't disappear into a black hole for a year and then come back out just as everyone's transitioned over to Office 365 and they're all a bit confused as to why they need to change Outlook all of a sudden. So this is perhaps a useful slide for some people just to understand or present the complexity to business sponsors. But I think it has some good things in there as well.
Yeah, that's a vital slide there. That change piece you mentioned, I can't stress enough. The technical piece obviously is what it is, but the change piece, we had a change manager on the program full time, and she dealt with both the change in the IT team and in the organization that will be using the new systems, and it was absolutely vital.
Yeah, good points and good reinforcement, Karl. Thank you. Now, I'll just give a quick reminder. If you've got any questions, if there's anything that you don't think we've covered in enough detail, or that is specific to your scenario, do please make sure to ask questions in the app. It's just on the right hand side there. So ask away, and we'll cover those questions off in the next 10 minutes or so. So, Karl, some of the challenges around cloud implementation, and perhaps some that you experienced during your most recent implementation. But do you want to walk us through these 5 points on this slide?
Sure, yeah. So these are very much the technical implementation side. We've obviously touched on change, which I think is as if not more important, but this side of things, so IaaS and DaaS is what we did. So we moved to infrastructure as a service and desktop as a service primarily with Office 365 for software as a service, and network configuration on the IaaS side and the DaaS side was absolutely just much bigger than we ever expected. The DaaS side, fortunately, was largely managed by the implementation partner we worked with, but the IaaS side, it was our servers, our infrastructure, and we had to do a lot more configuration and implementation on virtual networks, software-defined networks, and so on than we ever expected. So, for anybody thinking about it, make sure you've got a really hot network partner to work with, or the skills in-house that you can really rely on to do that. So that caught us out quite a bit, and that introduced a lot of delay. And then just some really specific kind of application layer stuff. So the next 2 points you could always join together. SharePoint was just a really good example for us, where we had a SQL cluster running for our SharePoint farm, and the migration tools that we were using, we found out at the very last minute couldn't migrate a SQL cluster, so we had to break the cluster and change the farm, and that introduced delays. And that's the sort of application dependencies piece a little bit as well. So not just the applications that users use and how they need to integrate and how that data needs to flow, and therefore when all these connected systems need to move, or ensure you have network connectivity between, but even the layer below. Make sure you understand those dependencies with whatever tools you might be using to move, or what you're moving to. Just really check all those dependencies. I know it sounds pretty obvious, and we thought we had it all sewn up, but it can catch you out still sometimes. And legacy applications, it's just a lead on into that. You've got to make sure that the new platform you're moving to can support and run those legacy applications. Don't assume anything just because it says it's can support Windows Server X, Y, and Z version, that it's the same version that you might use, because the cloud versions are often slightly different. So yeah, just really understand your application architecture, really understand the versions, nail down in writing as much as possible with everybody what can and can't run, and yeah, get that all really clear in your mind before you press any buttons.
That last point you made there, Karl, that is a really good and often overlooked point in cloud migrations, that sometimes the cloud versions are not necessarily the same versions that you're using. They may be based on the enterprise versions of software that you've not previously been using, and there can be some slight configuration differences in that migration. Yeah. Very often your cloud provider, if it's Microsoft that you're working with for a SQL migration or something like that, they may be after offer some help and support depending on the nature of your relationship with them. But do make sure that you are considering and planning for that need to cover that off as part of your cloud migration. Don't just assume, oh, okay, it says it's version X, we're version X2, we're good to go. Just make sure that's ticked off exactly as Karl said. Really good advice, Karl, and so very often overlooked.
Cheers.
Okay, so our next slide, some of the pre-start considerations, and Karl, this is a really good list that you put together as part of your SJA engagement. So why don't you walk us through some of the thinking behind this, and then we're going to run into questions. We've got a few questions that have been asked by the audience, so we're going to ask some of those. But if there's anyone with any other questions, please do ask them now. Karl, over to you.
Great, thanks, Darren. So we've touched on quite a lot of this. So looking at the time, I'm not going to spend a huge amount on each one. And if people want to ask questions afterwards about detail, that's great. But the business case, I think we've touched on a lot of that in previous slides and chats. Just really know why you're moving to the cloud. Don't do it because all your friends are doing it. And really make sure it's going to meet your business needs and requirements, and don't jump headlong into it. And understand your costs, your total costs really well, to make sure that it's, it is going to cost what you think. It's quite difficult to actually calculate what it will be to run something in the cloud quite often. And again, partners are, they've got a lot of tools to actually help you with that nowadays. And I think there might be some good ones directly from Microsoft too now, but certainly when we were doing it, it was quite a difficult thing. The plan, technical and commercial analysis and viability. It sounds really posh and big, and but we've touched on this as well, and it's part of the business case piece, really. Make sure that you know what you've got. That's huge. For us, we were merging 42 counties into a single national organization, and we sort of put my hand up. We thought, oh well, it doesn't really matter, we'll just move to the new stuff and then the old stuff will come along, and it doesn't matter too much what we've got. But it really delayed the project not having that landscape mapped out in detail. So yeah, make sure you do that pre-program planning. People, that's the change stream for me. So we had a stream with a change lead, and make sure that people know they'll be upskilled. You're not just going to leave them in the wilderness. Make sure you've got your training program sorting out, and basically your operating model going forwards for your team. And that either they have the resources and bandwidth to do this, or that you have partners to backfill or partners to do the work. Understand the impact on the people that you're affecting in your team, because they may think, well, I used to always look after the storage. We don't have storage anymore. I'm going to be gone, so have a real deep dive into that sort of thing, and the users that ultimately will be using the system. Vendor lock-in is a really, really good one. And we touched on this a little bit earlier about moving between cloud providers. Make sure whoever you move to, you've got a way to move out. That can be a really, really difficult thing for a lot of people. They think it's great, we're going to go here and it's going to be amazing, and they go there and it might be everything they think, but there might be a better offering later on and they can't move to it, or certainly not easily. So make sure in your contract negotiations, in your planning, everything, you've got a way out. Data
I understand the cost of that, right, Karl? The cost of exit.
Yeah.
Trying to understand that also.
Absolutely, yeah. And make sure that's in the contract as well. Who's going to pay for you to move? Is it going to be free support? Is it going to be a paid, all those things. And we've touched on security a lot, but compliance is a big one. Obviously GDPR this year. Make sure you know where your data needs to be. So not all data has to be in the EU. It depends on what it is, so get that nailed. As Mike said earlier, security is pretty much as you want it to be in the cloud. We've touched on partners for the build bit. I've mentioned about having people, help you with that experience and knowledge. But also, when I mentioned the management of the cloud earlier, going forwards, you might want to think about whether you need to do that, or whether you could leverage a partner for some of that to free up your own IT team or resources even further. So that's definitely something that we should always build into the plan, as well as assessing the ongoing work required and who should do that and who's best placed to do that. Program and change management, I think, is a governance wrapper that you just have to have on this one, because it is a complex change. This hits 4 out of 4 of those bullet points that Darren had up on, I think, slide 2 or 3. Ongoing management, we've sort of mentioned that already. Well, I did, sorry. Who's gonna manage it for you? Is it going to be you? Is it going to be a partner? Is it going to be a partnership? That's a flyby of that slide.
Karl, thank you very much. That was at speed, and there's a great deal more value behind those points. So do think about those as you're going through. Mike, have you got anything to add to that slide? Because I know you've experienced this a lot as well.
Yeah, just a couple of things, I guess, to reinforce some of the points that Karl makes. I think he's done a really good job of summing up the last 2 slides, actually, in terms of pre-start considerations and some of the challenges. It really is amazing how many organizations don't know what they've got now, where their starting point is. So understanding and doing that in some depth as to where we are today, what have we got, what are the dependencies from an application point of view is a really important step to kind of moving things forward. The one thing that wasn't necessarily mentioned in the last couple of slides is that of licensing considerations, particularly linked to things like enterprise agreements, et cetera, and the potential complexity, and I use the word potential deliberately, of being able to port licenses across the different cloud platforms.
Yes.
Based upon your ownership, you might have some sunk costs there that needs some consideration. And I think also the methodology of how can I do this safely without impacting the day-to-day. At some point, a changeover is going to have to happen. Yeah, how do we do that with the correct contingency? So should things not quite go as we planned, we've got the ability to roll back and protect ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's really to enforce a lot of Karl's points, because I think he does a really good job of articulating them. He's lived and breathed them. But just to reinforce a few and add a few there.
Yeah, I agree. These are all very good points. So well done. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left for questions. So, Mike, why don't you ask the first question, and then let's see who it needs to go out to.
Yeah, I think it's probably best for Karl, but let's see. So knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? I suppose that really is one for you, Karl.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So, I mentioned all the dependencies piece and, how you need to map that all out. So I would definitely do that differently. I've touched on that already. That's absolutely key. Know your estate inside out. But I think the biggest one for me was, while we had a change manager and a change stream, and it was all, we thought at the time we were doing enough. You need to do more. And I think if I could do it again, I would probably have a slightly bigger change team with more full-time support, because it really requires somebody or people to hold the hands of individuals around the organization. Some need more than others. And while we had a change champion network and all those good things, I just think having some more dedicated resource there would have helped with some of the people that were, getting quite anxious and stressed out pre-move about how it would affect their ability to do their jobs. So yeah, that's definitely a big one. And I'll just add on to that as well, that we tried to do quite a lot of it ourselves. It took longer, it was more difficult, other work suffered. So I think, we did try to find some partners to work with and struggled, and therefore did take it a lot on ourselves. But if I was doing it now with the experience that people will have, I think I'd probably have gotten a bit more help from the outside.
Brilliant, Karl. I completely agree with you there. Very often, project and change management is an undervalued resource, and it's only after the event that some people can realise. So I think that's a really good point. Right, one last quick question, Mike. Is there one there that's? I'll pick the quickest one of the lot, so we can let our webinar draw to a natural close.
Yeah, sure. Where should I start?
Where should you start? Wow. Well, you should definitely start by re-listening to the webinar. Re-listen to the webinar, and then if you're still needing a little bit more help, then reach out to Mike and myself at Foundation, Mike at Foundation IT, and myself at Fifth Step, and we'll make sure that we're putting you in contact with the right people with the right skills and resources, people like Karl with the experience of Karl, to actually make sure that you can get this done in the right way for your organization. Mike, anything else that you'd add to that?
Yeah, it's a good point, and without wanting to deter people from reaching out, I think the other beauty, as we said earlier on, is you can literally just set up and have a play, and I'd encourage anybody to experiment with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. There's no harm in doing that, and I think it also gives teams something to focus on outside of their day job.
Mike, that's fantastic. Karl, thank you so much for your input and for providing so much information back about that very interesting engagement. That's fantastic. And thank you everyone for listening and staying on the line for an extra 5 minutes just for those last questions. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's webinar. We will be posting this out, as I said, onto the internet, making that available via YouTube and via podcast. So if you know anyone who would like to listen to it, that's the best mechanism to download it. Thank you very much again for your time, and I look forward to you joining us the next time on the next Fifth Step webinar.